The candle flame trembled as the pen touched paper, and with that single stroke, Eleanor Whitmore became a duchess to a man she had spoken to only twice in her life. Edmund Ashford, Duke of Calloway, did not look at her as he signed his own name beneath hers. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window, as though the ceremony taking place in his own drawing room belonged to someone else entirely. The clerk from the Archbishop's office cleared his throat and gathered the documents with the practiced indifference of a man who had witnessed 100 such arrangements. To him, this was simply another contract. To Eleanor, it was the end of the only life she had known. Her father, the Earl of Rendale, stood by the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back, satisfaction written plainly across his face. He had spent 11 months maneuvering for this moment, trading favors, calling in old debts, and quietly threatening anyone who might stand in the way. The alliance between the Rendale and Calloway names would secure his position in Parliament for a generation. Eleanor understood the calculation even if she had never been permitted to question it. Her marriage was not a beginning. It was a payment. She turned to look at her new husband, searching his face for something, anything, that might soften the moment. He offered her nothing. His expression was carved from the same cold stone as the columns outside his townhouse, and when their eyes finally met, there was no warmth in his, only the weary resignation of a man discharging an obligation. "It is done," he said, his voice flat. "We will depart for Calloway Hall within the week." Eleanor lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how the words struck her. "As you wish, Your Grace." The formality between them was already a wall, and she suspected neither of them knew how to begin tearing it down, or whether they wanted to. Later that evening, alone in the guest chamber assigned to her for these final nights before departure, Eleanor allowed herself the luxury of tears, though only for a moment. She pressed her palms against her eyes and breathed until the ache in her chest subsided. She thought of her younger sister Charlotte, still unmarried and vulnerable to whatever scheme their father might concoct next, and her younger brother, Henry, whose modest inheritance depended entirely on their father's continued influence. This marriage had purchased their safety, even if it had cost her own. She would not regret it. She could not afford to. Across the city, in the study of his townhouse, Edmund poured himself a glass of brandy he did not intend to drink. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, sat across from him, her needlework forgotten in her lap. "You look like a man attending his own funeral," she said. "I feel rather like one," Edmund replied. "The alliance was necessary, Edmund. Lord Pemberton has been circling our family's holdings for 2 years. Without the Rendale votes in Parliament, we would have lost the northern estates by winter. I am aware of the arithmetic, Mother. I performed the calculations myself. Then what troubles you?" Edmund set the glass down without drinking from it. "I have bound myself to a stranger for the rest of my life, and I do not even know if she can tolerate my company past the length of a dinner." Margaret's expression softened, though only slightly. "Tolerance is not required for a successful marriage, my son. Only cooperation." "How comforting," Edmund muttered, and said nothing more that night. The week that followed passed in a blur of preparations. Trunks were packed, staff reassigned, and the household at Calloway Hall notified of their new mistress's impending arrival. Eleanor met her husband only twice more before their departure, both occasions brief and businesslike, discussions of travel arrangements rather than anything resembling courtship. She began to accept that this would be the shape of her life, a partnership built on documents and duty, devoid of anything softer. She was not entirely wrong, but she was not entirely right either. On the morning of their departure, Eleanor stood on the front steps of her father's house, watching servants load the final trunks into the waiting carriage. Charlotte clung to her arm, her eyes red from crying the night before. "You will write to me," Charlotte said. It was not a question. "Every week," Eleanor promised. "Perhaps more, if the Duke's household proves as dull as I fear." Charlotte managed a small, watery laugh. "And if he proves unkind?" Eleanor squeezed her sister's hand. "Then I shall manage him, as I have managed everything else." The words sounded braver than she felt. Their father approached, offering a stiff embrace and a few final words of advice about proper conduct and the importance of maintaining appearances. He did not ask if she was frightened. He did not ask if she was happy. Eleanor had long ago stopped expecting either question from him. The Duke arrived precisely on time, his own carriage falling in line behind hers as the small procession made its way toward the road leading north. Eleanor watched her childhood home shrink behind her through the carriage window, and something in her chest tightened with a grief she had not expected to feel so sharply. She did not yet know that the man riding ahead of her, The stranger she had married for the sake of votes and alliances was equally uncertain of what awaited them both. Edmund rode in silence for the first hour of the journey, his thoughts circling the same tired arguments he had rehearsed for months. Duty before desire, family before self. The Calloway name had survived 3 centuries through sacrifice, and his own comfort was a small price to pay for its continuation. And yet, as the carriages stopped at midday to rest the horses, and Edmund stepped down to find Eleanor already standing at the edge of the road, studying the countryside with quiet curiosity rather than complaint, something shifted in him. She had not summoned a servant to fetch her a chair. She had not demanded refreshment be brought immediately. She simply stood, taking in the unfamiliar landscape that would soon become her home, her posture straight and her expression unreadable. "You are not what I expected," Edmund said before he could stop himself. Eleanor turned, startled that he had spoken to her without prompting. "And what did you expect, Your Grace?" Tears, complaints, a request to turn back. "I do not waste effort on requests I know will be refused," she said simply. "It is a poor use of energy." Edmund studied her for a long moment, something flickering behind his eyes that he did not yet have a name for. "A practical philosophy. I find it serves me well." The conversation ended there, brief and unremarkable on its surface, but something had passed between them nonetheless, a small crack in the wall neither had intended to build so carefully. Edmund returned to his horse without another word, and Eleanor climbed back into her carriage, both of them turning the exchange over in their minds for the remainder of the journey. Neither said anything more that day, but the silence between them had changed shape. It was no longer the silence of strangers with nothing to offer one another. It was the silence of 2 people who had, for the first time, glimpsed something unexpected in the other, and were not yet certain what to do with it. By the time the carriages reached the inn where they would spend their first night on the road, the sun had begun to set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage stiff and tired, and found Edmund already waiting to offer his hand, an unnecessary courtesy that surprised them both. She accepted it without comment, and for a brief moment, their hands remained joined a fraction longer than propriety required. Neither of them spoke of it, but neither of them forgot it either. That night, as Eleanor lay in the narrow bed of the inn's finest room, listening to the sounds of the countryside beyond her window, she found herself thinking not of her father's ambitions, nor of the political alliance her marriage had secured, but of the brief, unexpected warmth in her husband's eyes when he had looked at her on the roadside. It frightened her more than the wedding had. A marriage of convenience she could manage, a marriage of feeling, with a man who had made his indifference so plain, was a danger she had not prepared herself for. Down the hall, in his own chamber, Edmund stared at the ceiling and told himself that the flicker of interest he had felt was nothing more than curiosity. The natural response to discovering his new wife possessed more substance than the society matrons who had paraded their daughters before him for years. He told himself this several times before sleep finally claimed him. Neither of them slept easily that night, and neither of them yet understood that the marriage they had entered as a transaction had already begun, quietly and without permission, to become something else entirely. The road to Calloway Hall stretched on for 2 more days, and with each mile, the careful distance both had maintained grew a little harder to preserve. At the second inn, a small disturbance broke the routine of their journey. A merchant's cart had overturned on the narrow bridge ahead, spilling crates of goods across the road and blocking passage for every carriage behind it. Edmund dismounted at once, striding forward to assess the damage, while the merchant, a stout man with a graying beard, wrung his hands and apologized to anyone who would listen. Eleanor stepped down from her carriage without waiting for permission, gathering her skirts as she crossed the muddy road toward the scene. Edmund glanced back, surprised to see her there at all. "There is no need for you to trouble yourself," he said. "There is every need," she replied, already crouching beside a crate of scattered apples, "unless you intend for us to sit idle until nightfall, while your driver argues with this poor man about who is at fault." Edmund opened his mouth to object, then closed it again. He watched as Eleanor directed 2 of the footmen to help right the cart, calm and efficient in a way he had not anticipated from a woman raised amid the comforts of an earl's household. Within a quarter hour, the road was clear, the merchant profusely grateful, and the procession moving once more. "You handled that well," Edmund said as he helped her back into the carriage, the words coming out more genuine than he intended. "I have 5 younger siblings," Eleanor said. "Chaos does not frighten me, Your Grace. It simply requires organizing." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of Edmund's mouth. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, but Eleanor saw it, and something in her chest loosened slightly, a tension she had not realized she was carrying. That night, over a quiet supper at the inn, conversation came easier than either had expected. Edmund found himself asking about her family, her interests, the books she preferred, and Eleanor answered honestly, surprised by how naturally the words flowed once the initial formality had cracked. "You do not strike me as a woman who enjoys embroidery and gossip," Edmund observed. "I endure both when necessary," Eleanor said, "but I would rather read a treatise on agricultural reform than sit through another afternoon discussing the color of Lady Fenwick's new curtains." Edmund laughed, a short, surprised sound, as though he had forgotten he was capable of it. "Agricultural reform. That is not what I expected to hear from my own wife on our third day of marriage. I contain multitudes, Your Grace." "Edmund," he said suddenly, "you may call me Edmund. If we are to spend the rest of our lives as husband and wife, the title seems unnecessarily formal." Eleanor met his gaze, something warm and unguarded passing between them. "Then you must call me Eleanor." It was a small thing, the exchange of names freely given rather than titles dictated by rank, but it marked a shift neither of them fully understood yet. By the time they reached Callaway Hall the following afternoon, the marriage that had begun as a cold transaction had already, quietly and without either of their consent, begun to change into something neither had bargained for. Eleanor stepped out of the carriage and looked up at the enormous stone facade of her new home, its windows catching the afternoon light, its gardens stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Somewhere behind that grand exterior, an entire household waited to judge whether their new duchess would prove worthy of the name she now carried. She squared her shoulders and walked forward, Edmund at her side, both of them stepping into a life neither had chosen for love, but which had already begun, in small and unexpected ways, to feel less like an arrangement and more like the beginning of something real. The entire household staff of Callaway Hall stood assembled in two straight lines along the gravel drive, waiting to greet their new duchess with the practiced stillness of servants who had rehearsed the moment a dozen times that morning alone. Eleanor felt every eye upon her as she stepped from the carriage, and she understood at once that this was not simply a welcome. It was an evaluation. The housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Fairweather, stepped forward first, offering a curtsy so precise it bordered on theatrical. "Welcome to Callaway Hall, Your Grace. We are honored by your arrival." The words were correct, but the tone beneath them carried a chill Eleanor recognized immediately. This was a household that had run without a mistress for many years, ever since Edmund's father had passed and his mother had taken up residence primarily in the London townhouse. The staff had grown accustomed to answering only to the Duke, and Eleanor suspected more than a few of them resented the disruption her presence represented. She met Mrs. Fairweather's gaze without flinching. "Thank you, Mrs. Fairweather. I look forward to learning the rhythms of this house, and I trust you will guide me honestly rather than simply telling me what you believe I wish to hear." A flicker of surprise crossed the housekeeper's face, quickly smoothed away, but Eleanor had seen it, and she suspected it would not be forgotten. The following days settled into an uneasy rhythm. Edmund spent much of his time occupied with estate matters and correspondence related to Parliament, leaving Eleanor largely to her own devices as she familiarized herself with the sprawling house and its grounds. She took the task seriously, walking every corridor, questioning every steward, learning the names of every servant from the head butler to the youngest scullery maid, a diligence that did not go unnoticed among the staff, even if few of them said so aloud. It was on the fourth morning that the first true test of her position arrived, in the form of a letter delivered by a messenger who had ridden through the night from London. Edmund read it standing in the study, his expression darkening with each line, and when he finally looked up, Eleanor was standing in the doorway, drawn by some instinct she could not name. "What has happened?" she asked. Edmund hesitated, clearly weighing whether to share the contents with her at all, a hesitation that stung more than she expected. "Nothing that concerns you." "Everything that concerns this family concerns me now, Edmund. That was rather the point of the arrangement, was it not?" He studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, and then, almost reluctantly, he extended the letter toward her. "Lord Pemberton has begun circulating rumors in Parliament, suggesting our marriage was arranged under improper circumstances, implying coercion on your father's part. If the accusation gains traction, it could unravel the very alliance this marriage was meant to secure." Eleanor read the letter twice, her jaw tightening with each pass. "This is absurd. My father did not coerce anyone. If anything, it was Pemberton's own faction that pressured the vote against your family's northern holdings in the first place." "I am aware," Edmund said grimly, "but awareness does not undo damage already spreading through drawing rooms across the city." "Then we must counter it. Eleanor said, her mind already working through the problem with a clarity that seemed to startle him. A public appearance, something that demonstrates unity, affection even, so thoroughly that no one could credibly claim this marriage was built on coercion. Edmund raised an eyebrow. You are suggesting we perform affection for the benefit of society. I am suggesting we demonstrate the truth as we choose to shape it, Eleanor corrected. Perception is often mistaken for truth in circles such as these. We simply ensure the perception favors us. Edmund studied his wife with new interest, the political instincts she displayed catching him entirely off guard. He had married her for her father's votes, never imagining she might possess strategic instincts sharper than half the men who sat in Parliament debating policy they barely understood. You surprise me daily, Eleanor. I intend to keep surprising you, Your Grace. It seems the only way to hold your attention. The remark was lighter than the conversation preceding it, and Edmund found himself smiling despite the gravity of the letter still resting between them. It was a small moment, but it lodged itself somewhere in his chest, refusing to be dislodged for the remainder of the day. That evening they hosted a modest dinner for several of the neighboring gentry, the first social event of their marriage at Calloway Hall. Eleanor moved through the evening with practiced grace, engaging guests in conversation, deflecting questions about the suddenness of the marriage with warmth and humor, rather than defensiveness. Edmund watched her from across the room, struck by how effortlessly she commanded the space, how the guests who had arrived skeptical seemed to leave charmed. At one point, as the guests mingled before dinner, an older gentleman with a reputation for bluntness approached Eleanor directly. Forgive my candor, Your Grace, but the speed of this marriage has raised questions across London. Some say it was a matter of pure convenience, nothing more. Before Eleanor could respond, Edmund appeared at her side, his hand settling naturally at the small of her back, a gesture that surprised them both with how unforced it felt. My wife's wit alone would have convinced me to marry her twice over, Edmund said smoothly, though I confess her patience with tedious gossip is rather more limited. The gentleman laughed, apparently satisfied, and moved on to another conversation, leaving Eleanor staring up at her husband with an expression somewhere between amusement and genuine surprise. That was rather well done, she murmured once they were alone again. I have had considerable practice deflecting unwanted questions, Edmund admitted, though I confess this is the first time I have enjoyed doing so. The warmth in his voice was unmistakable now, and Eleanor felt something flutter beneath her ribs that she quickly attributed to the stress of the evening rather than anything more dangerous. The dinner concluded successfully, the rumors from London seemingly dampened, at least for the moment, by the visible warmth between the newlyweds. But as the last of the guests departed and the house settled into quiet, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep, her mind circling back again and again to the ease with which Edmund's hand had found her waist, the genuine warmth in his voice when he had spoken of her wit. She rose from her bed and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, making her way down to the library in search of a book that might distract her thoughts. She found Edmund there instead, seated by the fire with a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, staring into the flames with an expression she could not quite read. You are awake, she said, startled. As are you, he replied, gesturing toward the empty chair across from him. Trouble sleeping in a new house? Trouble sleeping in general, Eleanor admitted, taking the offered seat despite every instinct urging her toward caution. There is a great deal to think about. Pemberton's accusations? Among other things. She hesitated, then decided honesty served her better than pretense. I did not expect to find this marriage anything other than a duty to be endured, Edmund. I am finding it rather more complicated than that. Edmund's gaze met hers across the firelight, something raw and unguarded passing between them. I find myself in agreement, though I confess it troubles me more than I expected. Why does it trouble you? Because I married you for votes and alliances, he said quietly. Not for this. Whatever this is becoming. Eleanor's breath caught, the honesty in his words landing somewhere deep and unexpected. And if it becomes something neither of us planned for, what then? Edmund did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose from his chair and crossed the small distance between them, kneeling beside her seat so their eyes were level. Then I suppose we will have to decide, together, what to do with it. The moment stretched, charged with a tension neither had anticipated when they married beneath the disapproving gaze of a clerk and the calculating satisfaction of Eleanor's father. Edmund's hand rose, hesitant, to brush a strand of hair from her face, and Eleanor found herself leaning almost imperceptibly toward the contact before catching herself, pulling back with a sharp breath. It is late, she said, rising quickly. We should both retire. Edmund straightened as well, something like disappointment flickering across his features before he masked it. Of course. Good night, Eleanor. Good night, Edmund. She left the library with her heart pounding, retreating to her chamber, where sleep remained elusive for hours afterward. Behind her, Edmund remained by the fire long into the night, turning over the strange and unwelcome realization that the marriage he had entered purely for political necessity had somehow, without his permission, begun to matter to him in ways he had never intended to allow. Neither of them spoke of the moment the following morning, both retreating into careful politeness over breakfast, as though the near intimacy of the previous night could be undone through sheer determination. But something had shifted between them, subtle and undeniable, and as the days passed, the careful distance they had once maintained grew increasingly difficult to preserve. Unbeknownst to either of them, a stranger had taken up quiet residence in the village nearest Callaway Hall, a man employed by Lord Pemberton to observe the household and report back anything that might prove useful in the ongoing campaign to discredit the marriage. He watched from a distance as the Duke and Duchess rode together through the estate grounds one afternoon, laughing at some shared observation, and he made careful notes of what he saw. Notes that would soon find their way back to London and into hands eager to use them against the very alliance Eleanor had worked so hard to protect. The threat, though neither Eleanor nor Edmund yet realized it, had already arrived on their doorstep, waiting patiently for the moment it would prove most damaging. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Eleanor's sister, Charlotte, filled with news of home and a gentle inquiry about how married life suited her. Eleanor read it twice over breakfast, smiling at Charlotte's familiar humor woven through every line, before folding it carefully and tucking it into her sleeve. "Good news, I hope," Edmund said, watching her expression from across the table. "My sister remains as incorrigible as ever," Eleanor said fondly. "She asks whether you have proven tolerable company, or whether I require rescue. And what will you tell her?" Eleanor considered the question longer than she intended, aware of Edmund's eyes upon her, waiting. "I shall tell her the truth. That my husband is proving considerably more interesting than I expected, and considerably more troublesome to my peace of mind." Edmund's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile but held all the warmth of one. "I shall endeavor to remain troublesome then, if it pleases you." "It does not please me at all," Eleanor said, though her tone betrayed her. "That is rather the difficulty." Their days continued in this manner, small exchanges layered with meaning. Neither was yet prepared to name outright, each conversation chipping away at the careful walls both had built around themselves before the marriage began. Edmund found himself seeking her out in the evenings, no longer confining their interactions to necessity, but inventing reasons to share a meal, a walk through the gardens, a quiet hour in the library where conversation flowed easier than either had anticipated when they first exchanged vows before a disinterested clerk. Eleanor, for her part, found herself looking forward to these moments with an eagerness she tried and failed to suppress. She reminded herself often of the reason for this marriage, the votes and alliances that had brought them together, the political machinery that continued to grind on regardless of whatever softer feelings might be developing between them. But reminders, she was beginning to learn, held little power against the steady, quiet pull of genuine connection. It was toward the end of that second week that Edmund proposed a ride to the far edge of the estate, where a small lake sat nestled among ancient oak trees, a place he claimed had been his favorite as a boy. Eleanor agreed readily, eager for an excuse to explore beyond the house and gardens she had already come to know intimately. They rode in comfortable silence for much of the journey, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the fields, until the lake finally came into view, its surface calm and silver beneath the sky. Edmund dismounted first, offering his hand to help Eleanor down, and this time, neither of them released the contact as quickly as propriety might have suggested. "It is beautiful," Eleanor said, taking in the quiet scene before her. "I used to come here whenever London grew unbearable," Edmund admitted. "My father was not a warm man, and this lake became something of a refuge." Eleanor turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his admission. "You rarely speak of your father." "There is little worth saying. He taught me duty above all else, and very little else besides." Edmund's gaze drifted toward the water. "I believe he would have approved of this marriage, for all the wrong reasons. And you? Do you approve of it?" The question hung between them, heavier than either had intended. Edmund turned to face her fully, his expression unusually open. "I did not expect to, but I find myself approving of it more with each passing day, Eleanor, for reasons that have very little to do with votes or alliances." Eleanor's heart quickened, though she fought to keep her voice steady. "That is a dangerous admission, Your Grace." "Edmund," he corrected softly. "Edmund," she repeated. the name feeling different on her tongue than it had before, warmer somehow, more intimate. They stood by the lake as the sun began its slow descent, neither quite ready to close the distance between them, but neither retreating either. It was a fragile equilibrium, this space between duty and desire, and both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that it would not hold forever. The ride back to the house was quieter than the ride out, both of them lost in thoughts neither was ready to share, but the silence carried none of the coldness that had defined their earliest days together. It was, instead, the comfortable silence of two people beginning, however cautiously, to trust one another. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line as they departed, nor the careful notes he made before mounting his own horse and riding toward the nearest posting house, eager to send word to London of what he had witnessed that day. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Calloway Hall, one who arrived without warning, and whose presence immediately shifted the fragile peace that had settled over the household. Lady Whitcomb, a distant cousin of Edmund's late father, swept into the entrance hall with the confidence of a woman accustomed to disrupting other people's plans, her sharp eyes cataloging every detail of the house as though searching for evidence of mismanagement. "Edmund, darling, you might have ridden ahead," she said, embracing him with theatrical warmth before turning her attention to Eleanor. "And this must be the new Duchess. How very convenient this marriage turned out to be, for everyone involved." The barb was delivered with a smile, but Eleanor recognized it immediately for what it was. She had encountered women like Lady Whitcomb before, at countless dinners and balls throughout her father's political career, women who wielded charm as a weapon, and treated every conversation as an opportunity to establish dominance. "Lady Whitcomb," Eleanor said, offering a curtsy precisely measured to convey respect without deference. "We are honored by your visit, though I confess we were not expecting company." "I rarely announce my arrivals," Lady Whitcomb said breezily. "It ruins the element of surprise. Now, Edmund, do tell me everything. I have heard the most fascinating rumors circulating through London about the circumstances of this marriage." Edmund's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I am certain the rumors are considerably more fascinating than the truth, which is rather mundane." "Oh, I doubt that very much." Lady Whitcomb's gaze slid toward Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. "Lord Pemberton has been telling anyone who will listen that your father practically forced this union, my dear, through threats and coercion of the most unsavory kind. Some say the Duke had little choice in the matter at all." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Lord Pemberton has a talent for invention, it seems, alongside his talent for losing votes he once considered secure." Lady Whitcomb laughed, a genuine sound this time, some of the calculating edge softening slightly. "Well said, Your Grace. Perhaps you will do after all." The visit stretched across 3 uncomfortable days, during which Lady Whitcomb observed the household with an attentiveness that left both Edmund and Eleanor feeling perpetually scrutinized. She commented on the arrangement of furniture, the quality of the meals, the manner in which the servants addressed their new mistress, each observation delivered with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. On the second evening, as the 3 of them sat together after dinner, Lady Whitcomb turned the conversation toward more dangerous territory. "I understand Pemberton intends to raise the matter formally in Parliament," she said, watching Edmund's reaction closely. "A motion questioning the legitimacy of the alliance, built upon these rumors of coercion. Should it gain support, it could unravel everything your marriage was meant to secure." Edmund's jaw tightened. "Pemberton has no evidence, because there is none to find. The marriage was arranged through legitimate negotiation, nothing more. Evidence matters little in Parliament, my dear boy, when perception has already taken root." Lady Whitcomb's gaze shifted to Eleanor. "You would do well to consider how this marriage appears to outside eyes, Your Grace, rather than simply how it feels from within." The comment lodged itself uncomfortably in Eleanor's mind, long after Lady Whitcomb retired for the evening. She found Edmund still awake in the study an hour later, staring at correspondence spread across his desk with an expression of deep concentration. "You are troubled," she observed, stepping into the room. "Pemberton grows bolder by the day," Edmund said without looking up. "If he raises this motion formally, it will not matter that his claims are false. The damage will be done regardless of the outcome." Eleanor moved to stand beside him, studying the documents scattered across the desk. "Then we must ensure the outcome favors us so thoroughly that no reasonable person could credit his accusations. How do you propose we accomplish that?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "Pemberton's strategy relies on doubt, on the suggestion that our marriage lacks genuine foundation. The strongest counter to doubt is proof, undeniable and public, that whatever began as arrangement has become something entirely different. Edmund looked up at her then, something searching in his gaze. And has it become something different, Eleanor, or do you speak purely of strategy? The question hung in the air between them, far more personal than the political discussion that had preceded it. Eleanor met his eyes, aware that her answer carried weight far beyond the immediate crisis they faced. I do not know how to separate the two anymore, she admitted quietly. I did not expect to feel anything toward you beyond civil cooperation, Edmund. I find myself considerably further along than that, and I am not entirely certain how it happened. Edmund rose from his chair, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. I find myself in precisely the same position, and equally uncertain what to do about it. Perhaps, Eleanor said softly, we are not required to do anything about it. Perhaps we simply allow it to exist, and see where it leads. His hand rose to cup her face, gentle and hesitant, as though he feared she might pull away as she had in the library weeks before. This time, she did not retreat. She leaned into the contact, her breath catching as his thumb traced a soft line along her cheek. Eleanor, he murmured, her name carrying more weight than she had ever heard it hold before. Before either of them could close the remaining distance, the study door opened without warning, and Lady Whitcomb stood framed in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral despite what she had clearly witnessed. Forgive the intrusion, she said, though her tone suggested no genuine regret. I could not sleep and thought a book might help. I did not realize the study was occupied. Edmund stepped back immediately, though the moment had already been irreparably interrupted. Lady Whitcomb, we were discussing matters related to Pemberton's threats. Of course you were, Lady Whitcomb said, her expression betraying nothing of what she truly believed. I shall leave you to your discussion then. Good night, Your Grace. Your Grace. She withdrew, closing the door softly behind her, and the charged atmosphere of moments before dissolved into something more careful and guarded. Eleanor stepped back as well, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. That was rather poorly timed, Edmund said, a note of dark humor creeping into his voice despite the tension still hanging between them. Rather, Eleanor agreed, though a small smile tugged at her own lips. They said little more that night, both retreating to their separate chambers with thoughts too tangled to easily unravel. But something had shifted decisively between them in that brief, interrupted moment, an acknowledgement neither could now deny, regardless of how carefully they had once tried to keep their arrangement purely transactional. Lady Whitcomb departed the following morning, her farewell to Eleanor carrying an unexpected note of genuine warmth beneath its usual polish. You handle yourself well, Your Grace, she said, as she climbed into her carriage. Better than most women in your position manage. I suspect Pemberton has underestimated precisely what he is dealing with. I intend for him to continue underestimating me for as long as possible, Eleanor replied. It tends to work in my favor. Lady Whitcomb laughed, genuine this time. I believe I shall enjoy watching this marriage unfold, my dear. Do write to me, should matters grow interesting. With that she departed, leaving Calloway Hall considerably quieter, though the threat she had spoken of remained very much alive. 2 days later, the household staff noticed a change in their new Duchess that none of them could quite articulate but all of them recognized. Eleanor moved through her daily responsibilities with renewed purpose, taking a more active role in managing the estate's affairs, reviewing accounts alongside the steward, questioning practices that had gone unexamined for years under the previous arrangement. Mrs. Fairweather, initially resistant to the new Duchess's involvement, found herself grudgingly impressed by Eleanor's grasp of household management, her attention to detail rivaling that of housekeepers with decades more experience. You have a talent for this, Your Grace, Mrs. Fairweather admitted one afternoon, reviewing the revised budget Eleanor had prepared for the coming quarter. I confess I did not expect it. I have spent my entire life managing younger siblings and a household perpetually short on resources, Eleanor said. This is simply a larger version of the same problem. The housekeeper's expression warmed slightly, the last of her earlier reserve finally beginning to thaw. The staff have noticed your efforts, Your Grace. Whatever doubts existed when you first arrived, I believe they have largely been settled. The acknowledgement meant more to Eleanor than she expected, a small victory in a marriage that had begun surrounded by skepticism from every direction. She was proving herself, slowly but decisively, not merely as a political asset secured through her father's negotiations, but as a woman capable in her own right of commanding respect and managing responsibility. Edmund noticed the shift as well, watching from a distance as his wife transformed Calloway Hall's daily operations with quiet efficiency, earning the loyalty of a staff that had initially regarded her with suspicion. He found himself increasingly drawn into her orbit, seeking her counsel not only on matters of household management but on political strategy as well, discovering in her a partner whose insight rivaled that of any advisor he had previously consulted. It was during one such conversation, late one evening as they reviewed correspondence together in the study, that Edmund finally voiced the thought that had been building in him for weeks. "I did not marry you for this," he said quietly, setting aside the letter he had been reading. Eleanor looked up, uncertain of his meaning. For what, precisely? For partnership. For genuine counsel. For conversation I find myself craving rather than enduring. He met her eyes, something vulnerable and unguarded in his expression. "I married you for votes, Eleanor, and I have found something considerably more valuable instead." Eleanor's breath caught, the weight of his admission settling somewhere deep within her chest. "And what do you intend to do with that discovery, Edmund?" "I am not entirely certain," he admitted. "But I find myself unwilling to pretend it does not exist, regardless of how complicated it makes matters between us." The near miss in the study weeks before had left both of them cautious, uncertain how to proceed with feelings neither had anticipated when their marriage began. But the careful distance they had once maintained had eroded almost entirely now, replaced by something neither was prepared to name outright, but which neither could deny existed either. Outside the walls of Callaway Hall, however, the threat that Lady Whitcomb had warned them of continued to build. In London, Lord Pemberton reviewed the latest reports from his agent in the countryside, a satisfied smile spreading across his face as he read the detailed account of the Duke and Duchess's growing intimacy, information he intended to twist and weaponize in ways neither Edmund nor Eleanor yet anticipated. The fragile peace they had begun to build together was about to face its most severe test yet. A week after Lady Whitcomb's departure, Eleanor received a letter from her father that arrived with none of his usual formality. The handwriting was hurried, the words clipped, and as she read through the contents, her stomach tightened with a dread she had not felt since the night before her wedding. "Pemberton has grown bold," her father wrote. "He claims to possess evidence that our negotiations regarding your marriage included financial arrangements unbecoming of a proper alliance. I assure you no such evidence exists, but the accusation alone threatens to embarrass us both should it reach the ears of Parliament. You must prepare yourself and your husband for what may follow." Eleanor read the letter twice before folding it carefully and making her way to Edmund's study, where he sat reviewing accounts with the estate steward. She waited until the steward departed before speaking. "My father writes with troubling news," she said, handing him the letter. Edmund read it quickly, his expression darkening with each line. "Financial arrangements. He means to suggest your father purchased this alliance through bribery, rather than simple negotiation." "There is a difference?" Eleanor asked, though she understood the distinction mattered a great deal in the circles that governed their lives. "A significant one, in the eyes of Parliament," Edmund said grimly. "Negotiation is expected, even respected, among families of standing. Bribery, if proven, would disgrace both our houses and likely cost me my seat of influence entirely." Eleanor sat across from him, her mind already working through the problem with the same clarity that had guided her through every challenge since arriving at Callaway Hall. Pemberton cannot possess genuine evidence, because none exists. Which means whatever he claims to have found is either fabricated or badly misinterpreted. "That does not make it any less dangerous," Edmund said. "Fabricated evidence, presented with enough confidence, can prove as damaging as genuine proof, particularly in the court of public opinion." "Then we must discover what he claims to have before he presents it publicly," Eleanor said. "Knowledge is the only advantage we have against a man willing to invent whatever suits his purposes." Edmund studied her for a long moment, admiration mixing with concern in his expression. "You speak of this as though it were a game to be won, rather than a threat to everything we have built." "It is both," Eleanor said simply. "I have learned that the two are rarely separate, in matters such as these." They spent the following days in careful investigation, Edmund reaching out to contacts within Parliament who might know the nature of Pemberton's supposed evidence, while Eleanor wrote discreetly to her father, urging him to review every document related to the marriage negotiations for anything that might be misconstrued or twisted against them. The work brought them closer together than ever before, their evenings spent poring over correspondence and strategy with an intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with genuine partnership. It was during one such evening, as they sat together reviewing a list of Pemberton's known associates, searching for any connection that might reveal his source of information, that Eleanor finally allowed herself to voice a fear she had been carrying since her father's letter arrived. "What happens if he succeeds?" she asked quietly. if this fabricated scandal takes hold, regardless of the truth. Edmund set down the papers he had been reviewing, meeting her eyes directly. Then we face it together, Eleanor. Whatever consequences follow, we face them as partners, not as strangers bound by obligation. The words settled something anxious within her chest, a reassurance she had not realized she needed until it was offered. You mean that? I have never meant anything more sincerely, Edmund said, and the quiet conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. Their investigation eventually uncovered a troubling detail. One of the clerks who had assisted in drafting the marriage settlement, a man named Frederick Combs, had recently come into unexpected wealth, purchasing a townhouse in a fashionable district, far beyond what his modest salary could support. The implication was clear enough, though proving it would require delicate handling. Pemberton has bribed the clerk to alter or misrepresent the settlement documents, Edmund concluded, studying the information Eleanor had gathered through her father's discreet inquiries. If we can prove this, the entire foundation of his accusation collapses. Then we must move quickly, Eleanor said, before he presents his fabricated evidence formally. Edmund nodded, already drafting a letter to a solicitor he trusted implicitly, one who could investigate Combs's finances without drawing undue attention to their efforts. As he wrote, Eleanor watched him with something that had grown steadily over the preceding weeks into an emotion she could no longer deny, however inconvenient its timing. This was not the cold, distant man she had married beneath the disapproving gaze of a clerk weeks before. This was a partner, sharp and capable, who trusted her judgment as thoroughly as she had come to trust his. Whatever this marriage had begun as, it had become something considerably more meaningful, and considerably more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. The threat from Pemberton remained unresolved, as the week drew to a close, but the partnership Edmund and Eleanor had forged in confronting it together left both of them more certain than ever that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not as strangers bound by contract, but as two people who had, against every expectation, begun to genuinely care for one another. The solicitor's investigation into Frederick Combs moved faster than either of them anticipated, though the news it delivered proved more alarming than expected. Combs had not merely accepted a bribe from Pemberton, he had actively altered a copy of the marriage settlement, inserting language that could be interpreted as evidence of financial coercion, a forged document that Pemberton intended to present before Parliament as proof of his accusations. This is worse than we feared, Edmund said, pacing the length of his study as he absorbed the solicitor's report. A forged document carries far more weight than mere rumor. If Pemberton presents this before the assembled lords, the damage could prove irreversible, regardless of whether we eventually prove it false. Eleanor remained seated, her mind working through the problem with the same steady focus that had guided her through every crisis since her arrival at Calloway Hall. Then our response must be equally decisive. We cannot simply deny the accusation and hope reason prevails. We must expose the forgery itself, publicly and unmistakably, before Pemberton has the opportunity to present it. How do you propose we accomplish that? We do not currently possess the forged document itself, only the solicitor's account of Combs's activities. Eleanor considered the problem carefully. Combs is a man motivated by money, not loyalty. If he accepted a bribe from Pemberton once, he might accept a larger sum to reveal the truth, provided we approach him before Pemberton's plans reach their conclusion. Edmund frowned. You are suggesting we bribe the man who forged evidence against us. I am suggesting we offer him considerably more incentive to tell the truth than Pemberton offered him to lie, Eleanor corrected. There is a difference, however narrow it might appear. The plan carried obvious risks, chief among them the possibility that Combs might simply take their money and continue serving Pemberton's interests regardless, or worse, report their approach directly to his original benefactor. But with time running short and no better alternative available, Edmund reluctantly agreed to pursue it, dispatching his most trusted solicitor to approach Combs discreetly. The following days passed in tense anticipation, both Edmund and Eleanor attempting to maintain their normal routines while the weight of uncertainty hung over every conversation. Eleanor continued her work managing the estate's affairs, though her attention frequently wandered toward thoughts of Parliament and the accusation that threatened to unravel everything they had built. Edmund, for his part, found himself seeking her company more frequently than ever, drawing comfort from her steady presence even as the crisis around them intensified. It was during one such evening, as they walked together through the gardens after dinner, that Edmund finally addressed the question that had been building between them for weeks. Whatever happens with Pemberton, he said, I find myself grateful for your presence in ways I did not anticipate when this marriage began. Eleanor glanced up at him, the last light of evening casting soft shadows across his features. You speak as though you expect the worst outcome. I prepare for every outcome, Edmund said. It is a habit born of necessity, given my responsibilities. But regardless of what follows, I want you to know that this marriage has become something I value far beyond its original purpose. The admission, delivered with quiet sincerity, sent a warmth through Eleanor's chest that she no longer attempted to suppress or explain away. I feel precisely the same, Edmund. Whatever comes next, I do not regret the path this marriage has taken. They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer, the garden path winding beneath ancient trees that had witnessed generations of the Calloway family navigate their own trials and triumphs. It was a rare moment of peace amid the mounting tension, and both of them recognized it as such, savoring the quiet before whatever storm Pemberton intended to unleash. The storm arrived 3 days later, in the form of an urgent summons from London. Edmund's presence was required before Parliament within the week, where Pemberton intended to formally present his accusations regarding the circumstances of the marriage. There would be no further delay, no additional time to prepare their defense. We must depart immediately, Edmund said, reading the summons with a grim expression. I will need to appear before the assembled lords myself and address these accusations directly. Then I shall accompany you, Eleanor said, already anticipating his objection. Eleanor, this could become considerably unpleasant. Pemberton will not hesitate to attack your character alongside mine, if it serves his purposes. All the more reason for me to be present, Eleanor replied firmly. I will not have him speak of me, of my father, of this marriage, without someone present to counter his lies directly. I have faced worse than Pemberton's accusations, Edmund. I do not intend to hide from them now. Edmund studied her for a long moment, recognizing the same determination that had first caught his attention on the roadside during their journey to Calloway Hall. Very well, we face this together, as we agreed. They departed for London the following morning, their journey considerably more urgent than the one that had first brought them together as newlyweds. The comfortable silence they had grown accustomed to during their earlier travels was replaced now with focused determination, both of them reviewing strategy and preparing responses to whatever accusations Pemberton might raise. Word had reached them the previous evening that the solicitor's approach to Combs had yielded uncertain results. The clerk had neither confirmed nor denied the forgery outright, though he had accepted the offered payment and promised to consider his position carefully before Parliament convened. It was a fragile thread upon which their defense now depended, and both Edmund and Eleanor understood the considerable risk involved in trusting a man who had already proven willing to sell his integrity to the highest bidder. They arrived in London 2 days before the scheduled session, taking up residence at Edmund's townhouse while final preparations were made. Eleanor's father visited that first evening, his expression grave as he reviewed the situation with his daughter and son-in-law. Pemberton has grown reckless, the Earl of Rendale said, pacing before the fireplace with barely contained agitation. This forgery scheme, if exposed, could destroy his own standing entirely. He must believe himself considerably more secure than the situation actually warrants. Or he believes we lack the resources to expose him, Edmund countered, which, until recently, may well have been true. Eleanor's father turned to study his daughter with an expression she had rarely seen from him, something approaching genuine respect. You have handled this situation with remarkable skill, Eleanor. I confess I did not anticipate the political instincts you have displayed throughout this ordeal. I learned from watching you, father, Eleanor said, whether you intended to teach me or not. The following day brought final word from the solicitor regarding Combs. The clerk, apparently swayed by both the financial incentive offered and a growing fear of the legal consequences he might face should the forgery be discovered through other means, had agreed to provide a written confession detailing Pemberton's involvement in the scheme, provided his own role could be minimized in the resulting scandal. It is enough, Edmund said, reading the confession with evident relief. Combined with the solicitor's investigation into his sudden wealth, this should thoroughly discredit whatever evidence Pemberton intends to present. Eleanor felt the tension that had gripped her for days finally begin to ease, though she remained cautious. We should prepare for Pemberton to adapt his strategy, should he learn of Combs's confession before the session begins. Edmund nodded grimly. Which means we must ensure the confession reaches the right hands only when it will prove most effective, and not a moment before. The night before the parliamentary session, neither Edmund nor Eleanor slept easily, both acutely aware of how much depended on the confrontation awaiting them the following day. Eleanor found herself in the townhouse's small library well past midnight, unable to quiet her racing thoughts, when Edmund appeared in the doorway, similarly restless. You should be resting, he said, though he made no move to leave. As should you, Eleanor replied. Yet here we both are. He crossed the room and settled into the chair beside hers, the familiar comfort of their earlier evenings at Callaway Hall settling over them despite the tension of the coming day. Whatever happens tomorrow, Eleanor, I want you to know that facing this alongside you has meant more to me than I know how to properly express. Eleanor reached across the small distance between them, taking his hand in hers, a gesture that felt entirely natural despite the formality that had once defined every interaction between them. We will face tomorrow as we have faced everything else since this marriage began, Edmund, together. His fingers tightened around hers, and for a long moment, neither spoke, the quiet understanding between them saying far more than words could have managed. Whatever Pemberton intended to unleash the following day, they would meet it as true partners, bound not merely by contract and obligation, but by something considerably deeper that had grown between them despite every expectation to the contrary. The confrontation that awaited them in Parliament would test that partnership more severely than anything they had yet faced, but as they finally retired for what little remained of the night, both Edmund and Eleanor felt a quiet confidence that whatever the outcome, they would emerge from it together, their marriage stronger, for having weathered the storm rather than diminished by it. The morning of the session arrived cold and overcast, a fitting backdrop for the confrontation that awaited them. Eleanor dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep blue that conveyed both dignity and quiet strength, aware that every detail of her appearance would be scrutinized by the assembled peers and their wives, who would gather to witness the proceedings. Edmund met her in the hallway before their departure, his own attire immaculate, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed the weight of what lay ahead. You need not attend the session itself, Eleanor. I could arrange for you to wait elsewhere, spared the discomfort of hearing Pemberton's accusations spoken aloud. I have already told you my answer to that suggestion, Eleanor said firmly. I intend to be present, Edmund. Whatever Pemberton says about me, I would rather hear it directly than imagine it secondhand. They arrived at the appointed chamber, to find it already filling with lords and observers eager to witness the unfolding drama. Word of Pemberton's accusations having spread through London society with predictable speed. Eleanor took her seat in the gallery reserved for observers, her father settling beside her with a reassuring hand upon her arm, while Edmund proceeded to the floor where the session would formally begin. Pemberton rose first, his voice carrying easily through the chamber as he outlined his accusations with practiced theatrical flair, describing a marriage built upon coercion and financial impropriety, painting Edmund as a man who had sold his family's honor for political convenience and Eleanor's father as a schemer willing to manipulate his own daughter's future for personal gain. Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap as she listened, the accusations landing with painful precision despite their falseness. She glanced toward her father, whose expression remained carefully composed despite the insult being leveled against him before the assembled peers of the realm. When Pemberton finally called for the presentation of his evidence, a hush fell over the chamber. He produced the forged document with a flourish, reading selected passages aloud, his voice dripping with manufactured outrage, as he described the supposed evidence of coercion contained within its altered language. It was Edmund's turn to respond, and Eleanor watched with pride as her husband rose to address the chamber, his voice steady and commanding despite the gravity of the accusations leveled against him. Lord Pemberton's accusations rest entirely upon a document I can prove, beyond reasonable doubt, to be a deliberate forgery, Edmund began, and the chamber stirred with murmured interest. I present to this assembly a signed confession from the clerk responsible for altering the original settlement, detailing precisely how and why this forgery was created, at the direct instruction of Lord Pemberton himself. The revelation sent a wave of shock through the gathered peers, and Eleanor watched Pemberton's confident expression falter for the first time since the session had begun. Edmund proceeded methodically, presenting the solicitor's investigation into Combs's sudden wealth, the timeline of payments that could be traced directly back to Pemberton's own accounts, building an irrefutable case that transformed the accuser into the accused within the span of a single dramatic presentation. Pemberton attempted to salvage his position, denying the accusations with increasingly desperate insistence, but the evidence Edmund presented proved too thorough, too carefully documented, for his denials to hold credibility before the assembled lords. By the time the session concluded, the tide had turned decisively against him, murmurs of censure replacing the earlier interest in his original accusations. As the chamber began to empty, Eleanor made her way down to where Edmund stood receiving the cautious congratulations of several fellow peers, her heart still racing from the tension of the proceedings. He turned as she approached, and the relief visible in his expression matched her own. "You were magnificent," she said quietly. close enough that only he could hear. "We were magnificent," Edmund corrected. "This victory belongs to both of us, Eleanor. Without your strategic thinking, without your insistence that we pursue Combs before Pemberton could act, this outcome might have proven considerably different." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the successful defense of their marriage, and everything to do with the genuine partnership Edmund's words acknowledged. Whatever this marriage had begun as, a transaction built on votes and alliances, it had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated, but both had come to treasure. As they made their way from the chamber, Eleanor's father fell into step beside them, his expression carrying an unfamiliar warmth as he addressed his daughter directly. "I confess, Eleanor, I arranged this marriage believing only of the political advantages it would secure. I did not anticipate that you might find something considerably more valuable within it." "Neither did I, father," Eleanor admitted, glancing toward Edmund with an expression that spoke volumes. "But I find I am grateful for it, regardless of how it began." Pemberton's public disgrace marked a turning point, not merely in the political fortunes of the Callaway family, but in the marriage between Edmund and Eleanor themselves. The crisis that had threatened to unravel everything had instead solidified a bond neither had expected to form, transforming a political arrangement into a partnership built on genuine trust, respect, and something that increasingly resembled love, however neither of them had yet spoken the word aloud. With Pemberton's scheme thoroughly dismantled and his standing in Parliament severely diminished, Edmund and Eleanor found themselves finally able to turn their attention toward the honeymoon that had been postponed since their hurried wedding weeks before. Plans were made for a journey to the coast, a modest but comfortable estate belonging to a distant relative of Edmund's, where they might finally enjoy the privacy and leisure that circumstances had thus far denied them. The days leading up to their departure carried an anticipation neither had expected to feel. Eleanor found herself smiling at odd moments, thinking of the weeks ahead spent in Edmund's company without the looming shadow of political crisis, and Edmund, for his part, discovered himself counting the days with an eagerness he had not experienced since childhood anticipation of holidays long past. It was 2 evenings before their scheduled departure that everything threatened to unravel once more, though the danger this time came from a source neither had anticipated. Eleanor's father arrived unannounced at the townhouse, his expression carrying none of the warmth he had displayed following the parliamentary victory weeks before. Instead, his face was drawn and pale, and Eleanor knew immediately, from years of reading her father's moods, that something had gone seriously wrong. "Father," she said, rising quickly as he entered the drawing room where she and Edmund had been reviewing travel arrangements. "What has happened?" The Earl of Rendale glanced toward Edmund, hesitation evident in his expression before he finally spoke. "There is a matter I must discuss with you both, one I have avoided addressing for far too long." Edmund gestured toward the seating arranged near the fireplace, and once they had all settled, the Earl began his explanation with visible reluctance. "When I first arranged this marriage, I informed you both that it was purely a matter of political negotiation, an exchange of alliance for alliance." He paused, his hands clasped tightly together. "That was not entirely truthful. There was a financial component as well, a debt I owed to Edmund's late father dating back many years, one that this marriage was intended to settle." Eleanor felt her stomach drop, an uneasy premonition building even before her father continued. "Your grandfather, Edmund, extended considerable financial assistance to my family during a difficult period, decades ago, assistance that allowed the Rendale estate to survive what might otherwise have been ruinous circumstances. That debt was never fully repaid, and when your father passed and the negotiations for this marriage began, I saw an opportunity to settle it discreetly, through the marriage settlement itself, structured in a manner that would satisfy the debt without either of you needing to know the true nature of the arrangement." Edmund's expression had grown increasingly grim throughout this explanation. "You are telling me that Eleanor's hand in marriage was, in part, payment for a debt owed by her family to mine. I am telling you that the political alliance was genuine, but it was not the entirety of the arrangement," the Earl said carefully. "The settlement included provisions that effectively canceled the outstanding debt, provisions I deliberately kept vague enough that neither of you would question their purpose." Eleanor stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking under the weight of this revelation. "You are saying I was sold, father. Not merely arranged into a political marriage, but literally exchanged as payment for a debt. That is an unkind characterization of what was, ultimately, a mutually beneficial arrangement," her father protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Is it unkind, or is it simply true?" Eleanor's voice trembled with a mixture of anger and hurt that had been building throughout the entire explanation. "You allowed me to believe this marriage, however transactional in its political dimensions, was at least honest in its terms. Now I learned there was an additional layer of calculation, one you deliberately concealed. Edmund had remained silent throughout Eleanor's response, his own expression difficult to read, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried a coldness Eleanor had not heard from him since the earliest days of their marriage. Why reveal this now, after weeks of silence? What has changed? The Earl's discomfort deepened visibly. Pemberton's investigation, though ultimately discredited, uncovered enough of the true financial arrangements that he intends to raise the matter again, framed differently this time, not as coercion, but as a debt settlement disguised as marriage. I felt you both deserved to hear the truth from me directly, before he has the opportunity to twist it further. Eleanor turned away, moving toward the window, her mind racing through the implications of this revelation. Every moment of genuine connection she had believed had grown between herself and Edmund now felt shadowed by this new knowledge, the possibility that their marriage had been built on an even more calculated foundation than she had originally understood. "Eleanor," Edmund said quietly, but she did not turn to face him immediately. "I need a moment," she said, her voice tight with emotion she was struggling to control. Her father departed shortly after, offering apologies that felt hollow against the weight of what he had revealed, leaving Edmund and Eleanor alone in the drawing room, with a silence far heavier than any they had experienced since the earliest days of their marriage. "Eleanor," Edmund said again, moving closer, though he stopped short of touching her, sensing the fragility of the moment. "This changes nothing about what has grown between us." She finally turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Does it not? Everything I believed about the foundation of this marriage now feels uncertain, Edmund. Was your interest in me genuine, or was it simply the natural consequence of a debt your family was owed, dressed up as attraction?" "You cannot believe that," Edmund said, his own voice rising with something between hurt and frustration. "I did not know of any debt when I began to care for you, Eleanor. I did not know of it until moments ago, precisely as you did not." "But your father knew," Eleanor pressed. "Perhaps he selected me specifically, knowing the debt could be settled through this marriage, and perhaps that knowledge shaped his own approval of the match, in ways that trickled down through the entire arrangement, without either of us fully understanding the true motivations at play." Edmund fell silent, unable to immediately counter this possibility, and the silence stretched between them, charged with doubt and hurt that neither had anticipated facing on the eve of their long-delayed honeymoon. "I do not know what my father knew or intended," Edmund finally said. "But I know what I feel now, in this moment, looking at you. Whatever calculations existed at the marriage's founding, they cannot account for what has grown between us since. That growth has been genuine, Eleanor, built through weeks of shared crisis and quiet conversation, not through any debt settlement negotiated before either of us had any say in the matter." Eleanor wanted desperately to believe him, but the revelation had shaken something fundamental in her understanding of their marriage, reopening wounds she had believed largely healed since the earliest cold days of their arrangement. "I need time to think, Edmund. This is a great deal to absorb, on top of everything else we have already faced together." "Take whatever time you need," Edmund said, though the pain in his voice was evident. "But please, do not let this revelation undo what we have built. Whatever the marriage's origins, what exists between us now is real. I would stake everything on that truth." Eleanor retired to her chamber that evening without further conversation, her mind circling endlessly through the implications of her father's revelation, unable to fully separate her genuine feelings for Edmund from the nagging uncertainty about whether those feelings had been shaped, however indirectly, by circumstances neither of them had fully understood or controlled. Sleep proved elusive, and as the hours passed, Eleanor found herself returning again and again to the moments that had defined their relationship since its earliest days: the roadside conversation about practical philosophy, the shared laughter over agricultural reform, the quiet trust built through confronting Pemberton's scheme together, the tender vulnerability of Edmund's admission by the lake about his difficult relationship with his own father. None of these moments felt calculated or false, regardless of whatever financial arrangements had existed in the background of their marriage's founding. By morning, Eleanor had reached a fragile clarity, though uncertainty still lingered at its edges. She found Edmund in the breakfast room, his own expression showing the strain of a similarly sleepless night. "I have thought a great deal about what my father revealed," she said, settling into the seat across from him. "And I have concluded that whatever calculations existed at the beginning, they cannot diminish what has grown between us since. You did not choose to care for me because of a debt, Edmund. You did not know the debt existed until yesterday evening." Relief flooded across Edmund's features. "Then you believe me. I believe that our feelings for each other are genuine. regardless of the circumstances that first brought us together, Eleanor said carefully. But I confess I remain troubled by my father's willingness to deceive us both, and by the question of what other secrets might yet emerge to threaten what we have built. Then we shall face them as they arise, Edmund said, just as we have faced everything else. Together, and with complete honesty between ourselves, regardless of what others might choose to conceal. Eleanor reached across the table, taking his hand in hers, the gesture carrying the same quiet significance it had held during their tense evening before the parliamentary session weeks before. Together, then. Their departure for the honeymoon proceeded as planned the following morning, though the revelation of the previous days left both of them more aware than ever of how fragile trust could prove, even between two people who had genuinely come to care for one another. As their carriage rolled toward the coast, Eleanor found herself watching Edmund with a new appreciation for the honesty he had offered her throughout the crisis, an honesty that stood in stark contrast to her father's calculated concealment. Whatever awaited them at their destination, she understood now that their marriage had become something far more valuable than either of them had anticipated when they exchanged vows beneath the disapproving gaze of a clerk weeks before. It had become a genuine partnership, tested by crisis and secrets, but ultimately strengthened by the honesty and trust they had chosen to build between themselves, regardless of the calculations that had first brought them together. The journey to the coast took 2 full days, and unlike their earlier travels together, this time the silence between them carried no tension, only the comfortable ease of two people who had weathered genuine difficulty and emerged with their bond intact. They stopped for the night at a small inn overlooking a quiet valley, and over dinner, Edmund found himself sharing memories of his childhood he had never spoken aloud to anyone. Stories of summers spent exploring the grounds of Callaway Hall before his father's expectations had settled upon him like a heavy cloak. "You rarely speak of happiness from your childhood," Eleanor observed, listening intently, as he described a particular summer spent teaching himself to fish in the very lake he had shown her weeks before. "There was happiness, before duty consumed everything else," Edmund admitted. "I had simply forgotten how to access those memories, until recently." "What changed?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Edmund reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers with a tenderness that had become increasingly natural between them. "You changed it, Eleanor. Somehow, in the midst of political crisis and family secrets, you have reminded me that this life need not be defined entirely by obligation." The words settled warmly in Eleanor's chest, and for the first time since her father's revelation, the lingering uncertainty that had shadowed her thoughts began to genuinely dissolve, replaced by growing confidence in the authenticity of what existed between them. They arrived at the coastal estate the following afternoon, greeted by a small, dedicated staff who had prepared the house for their extended stay. The property was considerably smaller and simpler than Callaway Hall, situated on a bluff overlooking the sea, with gardens that ran wild in a manner Eleanor found immediately charming after the meticulously maintained grounds of her husband's primary estate. "It lacks the grandeur of Callaway Hall," Edmund said, watching her reaction as they walked through the modest entrance hall, "but I have always preferred its simplicity." "I prefer it as well," Eleanor said honestly, drawn toward the large windows that framed a spectacular view of the churning sea below. "There is something honest about a place that does not attempt to impress, Edmund. It simply exists, comfortable in its own character." That evening, as the sun set over the water in a display of brilliant orange and violet, Edmund and Eleanor walked together along the cliff path, the sound of waves crashing against rocks below providing a constant, soothing rhythm to their conversation. It was during this walk that Edmund finally raised the subject that had been weighing on his mind since his father-in-law's revelation. "I have been thinking further about the debt my grandfather extended to your family," he said carefully. "I do not wish it to remain a shadow over our marriage, unspoken and unresolved." Eleanor glanced at him, curious. "What do you propose?" "I intend to formally forgive whatever remains of the debt, entirely and unconditionally, and to have this recorded through proper legal channels, separate and distinct from our marriage settlement. I want it made clear, beyond any doubt, that our marriage was never a transaction to settle financial obligations, regardless of how it may have originally factored into your father's calculations." The gesture touched Eleanor deeply, a tangible demonstration of Edmund's commitment to building their marriage on foundations entirely separate from the complicated circumstances of its origin. "You do not need to do that, Edmund. I have already told you that I believe your feelings toward me are genuine, regardless of the debt's existence." "I know I do not need to," Edmund said, "but I want to, Eleanor. Not for your reassurance, though I hope it provides some, but because it feels right to separate our marriage entirely from any question of financial obligation. What exists between us should stand on its own merit, nothing more and nothing less. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, though these carried none of the anguish of her earlier distress. "That is one of the kindest things anyone has ever done for me, Edmund." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers as they continued along the cliff path, the gesture entirely natural now after weeks of growing intimacy. "I intend to spend the remainder of our marriage demonstrating precisely how much you mean to me, Eleanor. Not through grand gestures alone, but through the accumulated weight of daily choices, each one affirming that what exists between us is genuine and lasting." They paused near the edge of the cliff, the vast expanse of the sea stretching before them beneath a sky now painted in deep purples and blues, as evening settled fully over the coast. Edmund turned to face her fully, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "I did not marry you for love, Eleanor. I have been honest about that from the very beginning, and I will not pretend otherwise now. But somewhere between the political calculation of our wedding day and this moment, standing here with you beside the sea, I find that I have fallen in love with you regardless. Completely, and without any reservation remaining." Eleanor's breath caught, the words landing with a weight that seemed to still the very air around them. "Edmund, I do not expect you to feel the same, not immediately," he continued, though the hope in his eyes betrayed how much her response mattered to him. "But I wanted you to know the truth, unguarded and complete, before we proceed any further into this honeymoon that was meant to formalize a political arrangement, but which I now hope might instead become the true beginning of a marriage built on genuine love." Eleanor stepped closer, closing the small distance that remained between them, her hand rising to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart beating rapidly beneath her palm. "I have been afraid to name what I feel, Edmund, uncertain whether it was genuine, or simply the natural consequence of proximity and shared crisis. But standing here now, hearing you speak so openly, I find I can no longer deny it. I love you as well, completely and without reservation, regardless of how unexpected that outcome might have seemed on our wedding day." The confession hung between them, fragile and precious, before Edmund finally closed the remaining distance, his hand rising to cup her face with the same gentle hesitation he had shown in the study weeks before, though this time, there was no interruption to prevent what followed. His lips met hers softly, a kiss that carried none of the desperation or urgency that might have marked a less genuine connection, but instead conveyed a quiet certainty, a promise of commitment that extended far beyond the political calculations that had first brought them together. When they finally parted, Eleanor rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing unsteadily, overwhelmed by the significance of the moment. "Whatever secrets remain to be discovered, whatever challenges still await us, I find I am no longer afraid of them, Edmund. Not with you beside me." "Nor am I," Edmund said softly, his arms encircling her against the cool evening breeze coming off the sea. "Whatever comes next, we face it as we have faced everything else since this marriage began. Together, and with complete honesty between us." They remained on the cliff path until the last light faded entirely from the sky, reluctant to return indoors and end the perfect intimacy of the moment. When they finally did make their way back toward the house, hand in hand beneath the emerging stars, both of them understood that whatever remained of their honeymoon, and whatever years might follow it, would be built upon a foundation considerably more solid than the political alliance that had first brought them together as strangers before a disinterested clerk. The marriage that had begun as a transaction had, against every expectation, become a genuine love story, one written not through grand political maneuvering, but through the quiet accumulation of trust, honesty, and shared vulnerability that had grown between two people who had never anticipated finding love within an arrangement built purely on necessity. The weeks that followed at the coastal estate passed in a happiness neither Edmund nor Eleanor had fully anticipated when they first set out on this delayed honeymoon. Mornings were spent walking the cliff paths or exploring the small fishing village nestled below the estate, afternoons given over to quiet reading in the garden or lively discussions of literature and politics that stretched long into the evening hours. It was, Eleanor reflected more than once, precisely the kind of partnership she had never dared hope for when she signed her name to the marriage contract weeks before. But peace, they both understood, rarely remained undisturbed for long, particularly for a family whose standing in society invited constant scrutiny and occasional malice from those who resented their success. The disturbance arrived in the form of a letter from Edmund's mother, forwarded from Calloway Hall with an urgency that immediately concerned them both. Pemberton, though thoroughly discredited before Parliament, had not abandoned his campaign against the Callaway family entirely. Instead, he had shifted his efforts toward a more personal and insidious form of retaliation, spreading rumors throughout London society that questioned not the legitimacy of the marriage itself, but Eleanor's character directly, suggesting she had manipulated her way into the Duke's affections through calculated deception rather than genuine feeling. "He seeks to wound us where the parliamentary defeat could not reach," Edmund said grimly, reading his mother's letter a second time as though searching for details he might have missed. "By attacking your character directly, he hopes to sow doubt in society's perception of our marriage, regardless of the truth." Eleanor felt a familiar surge of anger, though it was tempered now by the confidence she had built through weeks of genuine partnership with her husband. "Then we shall counter it as we countered his previous attempts, directly, and with evidence that leaves no room for doubt." "This attack is more difficult to counter," Edmund said. "There is no forged document to expose, no clerk to bribe into confession. He attacks perception itself, the most difficult target to defeat with mere facts." Eleanor considered the problem carefully, drawing on instincts that had served her well throughout every previous crisis they had faced together. "Then we must offer society something more compelling than Pemberton's rumors. Not merely a defense, but a demonstration so undeniable that his accusations collapse beneath the weight of visible truth." "What do you propose?" "A public celebration," Eleanor said, the idea forming clearly as she spoke. "A grand ball at Callaway Hall, hosted jointly by both of us, demonstrating not merely tolerance or cooperation between husband and wife, but genuine partnership and affection, displayed openly before the very society Pemberton hopes to turn against us." Edmund considered the suggestion carefully. "Society is often skeptical of performances, Eleanor. If our display appears calculated or forced, it could backfire entirely, lending credibility to Pemberton's accusations rather than dispelling them." "It would not be a performance," Eleanor said firmly. "Everything I would display at such an event, Edmund, every gesture of affection and partnership, would be entirely genuine. I do not intend to perform love. I intend to simply allow what already exists between us to be witnessed by those who doubt it." The distinction settled something in Edmund's expression, admiration mixing with the deep affection he had come to feel for his wife over the preceding weeks. "Then let us return to Callaway Hall and prepare for precisely such an event." Their honeymoon, though cut shorter than either had originally hoped, concluded with a journey back to Callaway Hall filled with careful planning for the ball that would serve as both celebration and calculated defense against Pemberton's latest campaign of malice. Edmund's mother, initially skeptical of the plan's wisdom, gradually came around to its potential effectiveness as she witnessed firsthand the genuine warmth that had developed between her son and his wife. "I confess, Eleanor," the Dowager Duchess said one afternoon as they reviewed guest lists together, "I did not anticipate this outcome when Edmund first informed me of the marriage arrangement. I expected cooperation, perhaps mutual respect if you both proved fortunate. I did not expect this." "Nor did I, Your Grace," Eleanor admitted, "but I find myself grateful for the unexpected turn our marriage has taken." The preparations for the ball consumed the following weeks, Eleanor throwing herself into the planning with characteristic thoroughness, ensuring every detail reflected both the grandeur expected of the Callaway name and the genuine warmth she hoped to convey to their guests. Edmund, for his part, found himself increasingly involved in decisions typically left entirely to household staff, drawn by his desire to demonstrate the true partnership their marriage had become. Word of the impending ball spread quickly through London society, fueled in part by the lingering curiosity surrounding Pemberton's recent accusations and the parliamentary scandal that had preceded them. By the time the evening finally arrived, virtually every notable family within traveling distance had confirmed their attendance, eager to witness firsthand whatever truth might be revealed about the marriage that had generated such considerable gossip in recent months. Eleanor dressed carefully for the evening, choosing a gown of deep emerald that complemented her coloring while conveying the confidence and dignity befitting her position as Duchess. When Edmund arrived to escort her downstairs, his expression as he took in her appearance left no doubt as to the sincerity of his admiration. "You are breathtaking," he said simply, offering his arm. "You are rather handsome yourself, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, a teasing smile playing at her lips despite the nervous anticipation building within her chest. The ball began precisely as planned, guests arriving in a steady stream to be greeted personally by both the Duke and Duchess, a departure from typical protocol that immediately signaled the genuine partnership Eleanor hoped to convey. Throughout the evening, Edmund remained close beside her, his attention never wavering toward other conversations or distractions, his hand finding hers at unguarded moments, his eyes seeking her out across crowded rooms with an affection too genuine to be mistaken for mere performance. It was during the evening's second dance, as Edmund led Eleanor across the floor with practiced grace, that Lord Pemberton finally arrived, his presence causing a ripple of surprised murmurs through the assembled guests. He had not been formally invited, but propriety demanded he not be turned away publicly, and Eleanor caught sight of him watching from the edge of the ballroom, his expression carefully neutral despite whatever calculations were surely turning behind his composed exterior. "He has come to witness whatever weakness he hopes to exploit," Edmund murmured, following her gaze. "Then let us give him nothing to exploit," Eleanor replied, "and everything to envy instead." The remainder of the evening unfolded with Eleanor and Edmund moving through their guests together, their genuine warmth and partnership evident in every interaction, every shared glance, every quiet moment of laughter exchanged between dances. Eleanor watched as skepticism gradually transformed into genuine admiration among the gathered peers, Pemberton's rumors losing credibility with each passing hour against the undeniable evidence of authentic affection displayed before them. Near midnight, as the ball reached its natural crescendo, Edmund surprised Eleanor by requesting the attention of the assembled guests, a departure from their planned evening that caught her entirely off guard. "I find myself compelled to say a few words," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the now quiet ballroom, "regarding the circumstances of my marriage, which have generated considerable speculation in recent months." Eleanor felt her heart racing as every eye in the room turned toward them, uncertain what Edmund intended to reveal. "I will not deny that this marriage began as a political arrangement," Edmund continued, his gaze finding Eleanor's and holding it steady. "Negotiated between families for reasons of alliance and advantage, as many marriages among our class are arranged. I offer no apology for that beginning, for it is simply the truth of how we came to stand before an archbishop's clerk those months ago." A murmur passed through the assembled guests, and Eleanor caught sight of Pemberton's expression sharpening with anticipation, clearly believing Edmund's honesty might prove damaging rather than defensive. "But what began as arrangement," Edmund continued, "has become something considerably more precious than any political alliance could ever provide. I did not marry Eleanor for love. I have never claimed otherwise, and I will not begin claiming it now. But somewhere between our wedding day and this evening, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with my wife, not because circumstance demanded it, but because she has proven herself, time and again, to be a partner of extraordinary intelligence, courage, and genuine warmth." Eleanor felt tears threatening despite her determination to maintain composure before their assembled guests, moved by the public vulnerability Edmund was choosing to display before people who had, until recently, questioned the very legitimacy of their union. "Whatever rumors have circulated regarding my wife's character," Edmund continued, his voice hardening slightly as his gaze swept the room, "though it did not settle directly upon Pemberton, I can assure every person in this room that they are entirely without foundation. Eleanor has faced every crisis this marriage has presented with grace, intelligence, and unwavering integrity. I consider myself the most fortunate man in this room, not for the alliance our marriage secured, but for the woman I am fortunate enough to call my wife." The ballroom erupted into warm applause, and Eleanor watched as Pemberton's expression finally cracked, the calculated neutrality he had maintained throughout the evening giving way to visible frustration, as he recognized the complete failure of whatever scheme had brought him to witness this public display of genuine devotion. Edmund turned to Eleanor then, taking both her hands in his before the assembled guests. "I did not plan to make such a declaration this evening, but I find I can no longer keep private what has become the truest thing I know. I love you, Eleanor, completely and without reservation, and I intend to spend the remainder of our marriage proving that truth through every choice I make, for as long as we both shall live." Eleanor's response came without hesitation, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed ballroom despite the tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "And I love you, Edmund, entirely and completely, regardless of how this marriage began. Whatever calculations first brought us together, what exists between us now is real, and I intend to honor it for the rest of my life." The kiss that followed, brief but unmistakably genuine, sealed before their assembled guests what had begun as private confession weeks before on a windswept cliff overlooking the sea. The applause that greeted this public display carried genuine warmth rather than mere social courtesy, and Eleanor understood, watching the faces of their guests, that whatever damage Pemberton had hoped to inflict through his campaign of rumor had been thoroughly and permanently undone. Pemberton departed shortly after, his exit noted by several observant guests who understood precisely what his early departure signified. His campaign against the Callaway marriage had failed entirely, undone not through political maneuvering or legal confrontation, but through the simple, undeniable truth of genuine love displayed openly before the very society he had hoped to turn against them. The ball continued long into the night, but for Edmund and Eleanor, the true significance of the evening had already been achieved in that single public declaration. What had begun as a marriage of political convenience, arranged to settle debts and secure alliances neither of them had fully understood at the outset, had transformed completely into a genuine partnership built on love, honesty, and mutual respect. As the last guests finally departed and Callaway Hall settled into quiet, Edmund and Eleanor walked together through the now empty ballroom, exhausted but profoundly content with how the evening had unfolded. "That was rather braver than our original plan," Eleanor observed, leaning against her husband as they made their way toward the staircase. "I found myself unable to resist the opportunity," Edmund admitted. "Once I began speaking, the words simply demanded to be spoken." "I am glad they did," Eleanor said softly. "Whatever this marriage began as, Edmund, I would not trade the path it has taken for any alternative I might have imagined on our wedding day." "Nor would I," Edmund agreed, drawing her closer as they climbed the stairs together. The political calculations and family secrets that had once threatened to define their marriage, now firmly relegated to its past, replaced entirely by the genuine love that had grown between two people who had never expected to find such happiness within an arrangement built purely on necessity. Their marriage, forged in political convenience and tested by scandal, secrets, and calculated malice, had ultimately become precisely what neither of them had dared hope for when they first exchanged vows beneath the disapproving gaze of a disinterested clerk. It had become a genuine love story, one that would continue to unfold across the years ahead, built upon a foundation far more solid than any political alliance could ever provide. In the weeks that followed the ball, life at Callaway Hall settled into a rhythm neither Edmund nor Eleanor had thought possible when their marriage first began. The household staff, who had once watched their new duchess with cautious skepticism, now regarded her with genuine warmth and loyalty, having witnessed firsthand the steady competence and kindness with which she managed the estate. Mrs. Fairweather, in particular, had become something of an ally, the two women developing a working relationship built on mutual respect that neither had anticipated during those first uncertain days. Eleanor's father visited again in the early autumn, his manner considerably more humble than during his previous appearances. He had spent the intervening weeks reflecting on the consequences of his concealment, and when he finally sat with Eleanor and Edmund in the drawing room, his apology carried none of the calculated diplomacy that had once characterized his every interaction. "I have thought a great deal about my choices," he said quietly. "I convinced myself that arranging your marriage for both political advantage and financial settlement was simply prudent stewardship of family interests. I did not consider adequately what it might cost you, Eleanor, to learn the full truth so abruptly, nor did I consider the risk it posed to a marriage that had, by then, become something genuinely precious to you both." "You caused genuine harm, Father," Eleanor said, though her tone carried more understanding than anger now, the wound having largely healed in the months since. "But I have also come to understand that your intentions, however flawed in execution, were never intended to cause lasting damage. I forgive you, though I hope you understand why the concealment troubled me so deeply." "I understand entirely," the Earl said, "and I promise you, Eleanor, there will be no further secrets between us. Whatever remains of my involvement in your life, it shall be conducted with complete honesty from this point forward." The reconciliation, though not instantaneous, marked a meaningful shift in the relationship between Eleanor and her father, one built now on more equal footing than the deference and obligation that had once defined their interactions. Edmund, watching this exchange, found himself grateful for the resolution, understanding how much the earlier rupture had weighed on his wife despite her outward composure. As autumn deepened into winter, Eleanor found herself increasingly involved in matters extending beyond the immediate management of Callaway Hall. Edmund, impressed by the strategic instincts she had displayed throughout the Pemberton crisis, began consulting her regularly on political matters, valuing her perspective as genuinely as he valued that of any advisor within his circle. Their partnership, forged initially through crisis, had matured into a genuine collaboration that extended into every aspect of their shared life. Pemberton, thoroughly discredited both politically and socially following the events of the ball, retreated from public life almost entirely. His influence in Parliament diminished to the point of irrelevance. Occasionally word of his continued bitterness reached Callaway Hall through mutual acquaintances, but neither Edmund nor Eleanor found themselves troubled by these reports any longer. secure in the knowledge that whatever damage he had once hoped to inflict upon their marriage had been thoroughly and permanently undone. One evening in late winter, as snow fell softly outside the windows of the study where they had spent so many crucial evenings together throughout the preceding months, Edmund looked up from the letter he had been reading to find Eleanor watching him with an expression of quiet contentment. "What occupies your thoughts?" he asked, setting the letter aside. "I was simply reflecting on how far we have traveled since that first evening, when you signed your name beside mine without so much as a glance in my direction," Eleanor said, a fond smile touching her lips. "I could not have imagined, watching you then, that we might arrive at this place together." Edmund rose from his desk and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair much as he had done that night in the library weeks into their marriage, though this time, no hesitation marked his movements. "Nor could I have imagined it, though I find myself endlessly grateful that we did." "Do you regret any of it?" Eleanor asked. "The uncertainty, the crisis, the secrets that nearly unraveled everything before we found our way through them?" Edmund considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the pain those crises caused you, particularly the revelation regarding your father's concealment, but I cannot regret the path itself, Eleanor, for it led us here, to this marriage, to this love, which I would not trade for any easier alternative history might have offered instead." Eleanor leaned forward, resting her forehead against his in a gesture that had become deeply familiar and precious over the preceding months. "Nor would I, Edmund. Whatever this marriage began as, I am endlessly grateful for what it has become." Outside, the snow continued to fall over Callaway Hall's grounds, blanketing the gardens and the distant lake in quiet white, while within the study, two people who had begun their marriage as strangers bound by political necessity sat together in comfortable silence, their partnership having grown into something neither had dared to hope for on that cold morning when they first exchanged vows beneath the disapproving gaze of an indifferent clerk. Their story, which had begun with calculation and ended in genuine love, would continue to unfold across the years that followed, each day adding new chapters to a partnership built not merely on the political advantage that had first brought them together, but on the deeper foundation of trust, honesty, and devotion that they had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to build between themselves, regardless of every obstacle that had once threatened to keep them apart. Spring arrived at Callaway Hall with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the peace that had finally settled over Edmund and Eleanor's marriage. The gardens, which Eleanor had come to treasure during her first uncertain weeks in the household, burst into color once more, and she found herself spending long mornings walking the grounds, often accompanied by Edmund, who had gradually shed much of the guarded formality that had once defined his every interaction. It was during one such morning walk that Eleanor shared news that would mark the beginning of an entirely new chapter in their partnership. She had suspected for several weeks, the signs gradually becoming impossible to ignore, but she had waited to be certain before sharing the news with her husband. "Edmund," she said, pausing beside a bed of newly blooming roses, "I believe I am with child." Edmund stopped walking entirely, turning to face her with an expression of such complete and unguarded joy that Eleanor felt any lingering uncertainty about how he might receive the news dissolve immediately. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without a physician's confirmation, though I intend to send for one this very afternoon." Edmund closed the distance between them, drawing her into an embrace that carried all the tenderness and wonder of the moment. "Eleanor, this is the most wonderful news I could have imagined. I confess I had begun to hope these past months, but I did not wish to press the matter or add pressure to what was already such a full and complicated beginning to our marriage." "You need never worry about pressing such matters with me," Eleanor said, laughing softly against his shoulder. "I have found, throughout everything we have faced together, that honesty serves us considerably better than careful restraint." The physician's visit later that week confirmed what Eleanor had already suspected, and the news spread quickly through the household, greeted with genuine celebration by staff who had come to regard their Duchess with real affection over the preceding months. Mrs. Fairweather, in particular, seemed almost as delighted as Edmund himself, already making plans for the nursery that would need preparing in the months ahead. Word reached Eleanor's father within days, and his response, when it arrived by letter, carried a warmth that reflected how genuinely their relationship had healed since the difficult revelation of the previous autumn. He arrived at Callaway Hall himself shortly after, eager to see his daughter and to begin, in whatever small ways were available to him, making amends for the concealment that had once threatened to damage their relationship irreparably. "I find myself hoping for a granddaughter," he admitted during his visit, watching Eleanor with an expression of genuine tenderness that had been largely absent during her childhood, when his attention had so often been consumed by political ambition rather than family. Though I suspect, knowing your husband's family history, an heir will be expected regardless of my personal preferences. We shall be grateful for whichever child arrives, Father, Eleanor said, healthy and well, regardless of whether we welcome a son or daughter first. The months that followed brought their own challenges, as pregnancy proved considerably more demanding than Eleanor had anticipated, but Edmund remained a constant and attentive presence throughout, adjusting his own responsibilities to ensure he could be available whenever she needed support or simple companionship. Their partnership, already strengthened through the crises of the preceding year, deepened further still as they navigated this new chapter together. By early winter, as Eleanor's confinement approached, the household at Callaway Hall buzzed with quiet anticipation. The nursery had been prepared with careful attention, and Edmund had taken to spending his evenings reading aloud to Eleanor from whatever book currently held her interest, a habit that had become one of the great comforts of their marriage. It was during one such evening, snow falling steadily outside the windows much as it had during their conversation months before, that Eleanor's labor finally began. The following hours passed in a blur of activity, physicians and midwives moving efficiently through the household, while Edmund paced the hallway outside her chamber, forbidden entry by tradition but unable to remain still despite the restriction. When the cry of a newborn infant finally broke the tense silence of the early morning hours, Edmund felt a relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. He was admitted to the chamber shortly after, finding Eleanor exhausted but radiant, cradling a small bundle against her chest. "A daughter," she said softly, looking up at him with an expression of pure joy despite her obvious exhaustion, "healthy and strong, according to the physician." Edmund crossed to the bed, kneeling beside it to study the tiny face of his newborn daughter, overwhelmed by an emotion he had never before experienced with such intensity. "She is perfect, Eleanor, absolutely perfect. What shall we name her?" Eleanor asked. Edmund considered the question carefully before answering, his gaze moving between his wife and their newborn daughter, with an expression of complete contentment. "I had thought, perhaps, we might honor the place where everything between us truly began, where I first realized what you meant to me." "The lake," Eleanor said, understanding immediately. "You wish to name her after the lake." "Not precisely," Edmund said, a small smile touching his lips. "But perhaps something that reflects the honesty and clarity that place has always represented to me. Grace, perhaps. Grace Ashford." Eleanor looked down at their daughter, testing the name softly. "Grace. Yes, I believe that suits her perfectly." As word of the birth spread through the household and beyond, congratulations arrived from every corner of their acquaintance, including a surprisingly warm letter from Lady Whitcomb, who had followed the couple's story with considerable interest since her memorable visit the previous year. Even news of Pemberton's continued decline in influence reached them during this period, though neither Edmund nor Eleanor found themselves particularly concerned with his fate any longer, secure in the happiness they had built together. The years that followed brought further additions to their family, 2 more children joining Grace in the nursery at Callaway Hall over the following seasons, each birth deepening the bond between Edmund and Eleanor that had first begun, so improbably, through a marriage arranged purely for political convenience. The household that had once regarded its new duchess with cautious skepticism now could not imagine Callaway Hall without her steady, capable presence, and the political alliance that had first brought Edmund and Eleanor together had long since faded into irrelevance beside the genuine love that defined their marriage. Looking back, in quiet moments shared together as their children grew and their partnership continued to deepen with each passing year, both Edmund and Eleanor found themselves grateful for every difficult turn their story had taken. The cold formality of their wedding day, the political crisis that had nearly destroyed everything before it truly began, the painful revelation of hidden debts and calculated arrangements, all of it had ultimately led them to a happiness neither had dared imagine possible when they first exchanged vows beneath the disapproving gaze of an indifferent clerk. Their marriage, forged in necessity and tested by scandal, had become the truest partnership either of them had ever known. A love story, written not through grand declarations alone, but through the patient, deliberate choice, made again and again across every crisis and every quiet evening, to trust one another completely, and to build together a life considerably richer and more meaningful than either had believed possible on that first cold morning when they became strangers bound by contract rather than by love. That love, once found, never faded. It grew steadily with each passing season, weathering every storm that life presented, until neither Edmund nor Eleanor could imagine their existence without the other, their marriage standing as proof that even the coldest beginnings might, with honesty, courage, and genuine devotion, grow into something warm and lasting beyond anything either had once dared to hope for.